MKUltra, the CIA's infamous mind control program, developed from the behaviour control research project coordinated by the Tavistock Institute, along with the Scottish Rite Masons and other British, American, Canadian and United Nations agencies, and was derived from the eugenics practices of the Nazis and their psychiatric studies of schizophrenia brought to the US through Operation Paperclip. MKUltra began in 1952, the year that Huxley returned to the United States, accompanied by Dr. Humphrey Osmond, who was brought in by Alan Dulles to play a prominent role in the project of MKUltra. Like Crowley, Huxley's conception of the possibilities of mind-altering substances was shaped from his interest in William James. With the publication of The Varieties of Religious Experience, James introduced the study of, quote, religious experience, and incepted the confusion that confounds mystical experience with rational religious impulse. James suggested that the intense varieties of experience should be sought by psychologists, because they represent the closest thing to a microscope of the mind. James went so far as to try to induce the equivalent of a, quote, religious experience by experimenting with chloral hydrate, amyl nitrate, nitrous oxide, and even peyote. James claimed that it was only when he was under the influence of nitrous oxide he was able to understand Hegel. According to Crowley, in his autobiography, it is thanks in part to William James that he got the idea of employing the method of yoga to produce, quote, genius at will by attaining samadhi. In Crowley's Book of the Law, in a verse that certainly inspired generations after him, the demon Aiwass commands, quote, to worship me, take wine and strange drugs, whereof I will tell my prophet, and be drunk thereof. They shall not harm ye at all. It is a lie, this folly against self. The exposure of innocence is a lie. Be strong, O man, lust. Enjoy all things of sense and rapture. Fear not that any god shall deny thee for this. Crowley undertook a study of drugs and their effects upon the body and mind, experimenting widely himself. Many of his conclusions are present in his semi-autobiographical Diary of a Drug Fiend, in which his recreational drug use and also his personal struggle with drug addiction, particularly heroin, is well documented. After, quote, poisoning himself with, quote, every drug in and out of the pharmacopoeia, end quote, in search of the above preparation, Crowley came to believe that this substance was a, quote, sublimated or purified preparation of cannabis, Idacia, end quote. Crowley further claimed that this mysterious herb was one of the prohibited trees in the Garden of Eden. Huxley was first introduced to Crowley under H.G. Wells's guardianship. Crowley is reputed to have introduced the young Huxley to mezcal in a pre-Hitler Berlin hotel room, as well as introducing H.G. Wells to hashish. According to his Jewish homosexual lover Victor Newberg, Aleister Crowley confided to Huxley that Hitler was a practicing occultist, and also claimed that the OTO used mescaline to help the Nazis to gain power. Newberg wrote of an account of an after-dinner conversation between Crowley and Huxley in Newberg's Berlin apartment in 1938. Quote, you know Hitler has taken the stuff, mescaline, Crowley observes. I heard it from a reliable friend in the OTO. OTO? Inquired Huxley. The Ordo Templi Orientis, my local branch, you might say, and their connections with the Nazis are nobody's business. They almost founded the party, or at least subverted it. Do you know that 2 of their chief men personally trained Adolf Hitler? Before, he was a stuttering Austrian oaf, a shoddy bohemian, and a pervert to boot. They taught him oratory, rhetoric, and under the influence of this drug that will shortly, my dear Aldous, set your eyes on fire, gave him his daemon, end quote. Then, Huxley said, all this disparate romanticism that, in its waning, found expression in the irrational in secret cults has made its kingdom here? Fascism is, after all, the triumph of decadence, the final madness of Bohemia, end quote. So that carnage of Ahriman may be complete, precisely, Crowley replied. The man who introduced both Osmond and Huxley to LSD was, quote, Captain Alfred Hubbard, who had worked for the OSS during the war as a special investigative agent. Martin Lee, author of Acid Dreams, the complete social history of LSD, the CIA, the 60s, and beyond, reports that according to Captain Al Hubbard, Albert Hofmann, the Swiss scientist who discovered LSD, was part of a small group connected with Rudolf Steiner's anthroposophy in the early 1930s, who set out to make a, quote, peace pill to help mankind. Seeing the beginnings of the Nazi regime, they consciously set out to make something like LSD, after which they kept it secret from the world. In 1953, Osmond gave Huxley a supply of mescaline for his personal consumption. The next year, The Doors of Perception, a book, title drawn from a poem by William Blake, Huxley proclaimed that hallucinogenic drug, quote, expand consciousness. Huxley made the typical comparison of likening the mystical experience to schizophrenia. Quote, the schizophrenic is like a man permanently under the influence of mescaline, and therefore unable to shut off the experience of a reality which he is not holy enough to live with, which he cannot explain away, and which scares him into interpreting its unremitting strangeness, its burning intensity of significance, as the manifestations of human or even cosmic malevolence, calling for the most desperate of countermeasures, from murderous violence at one end of the scale to catatonia or psychological suicide at the other, end quote. Ultimately, MKUltra has its basis in the occult, inspired by Huxley's A Brave New World book, a dystopia where citizens are made to, quote, love their servitude. The notion has derived from the occult and an interpretation that ancient shamans used the, quote, soma of the Vedas, the wayoma of the Magi, to achieve trance states like communication with the spirit world through a type of demonic possession, identified with dissociative identity disorder, DID, or schizophrenia. The schizophrenic's detachment from reality, and particularly symptoms such as auditory hallucinations, are understood by the modern psychiatric establishment as corresponding to the trance states that attributed to the ancient mystics, and their supposed communion with the, quote, divine. The symptoms ascribed to schizophrenia have been noted for thousands of years, including in ancient Egypt, Hindu culture, ancient Greece and China, Islamic civilization, and even the witches of Europe. Rory Owen explained in, quote, Schizophrenia from Devilry to Disease, for Res Medica, the journal of the Royal Medical Society, that while such cases were once persecuted as forms of demonic possession, they are viewed today as a treatable mental condition. In, quote, Nietzsche's Madness, prepared but not published for the last issue of SFL in 1939, George Bataille says, quote, he who has once understood that in madness alone lies man's completion is thus led to make a clear choice not between madness and reason but between the lie of a nightmare of justifiable snores and the will to self-mastery and victory, end quote. Symptoms of mental illness found among mystics and shamans have often been characterized as, quote, divine madness, which is usually explained as a manifestation of religious or ecstatic experience found in many cultures. Plato in his Phaedrus and his ideas of theomania and a, quote, mad saint tradition exists in Buddhism, Hinduism, Sufism, Jewish Hasidism, and the, quote, holy fool of Eastern Orthodoxy. Tibetan Buddhists generally referred to, quote, madmen as Mahasiddha, a term for someone who embodies and cultivates the, quote, siddhi of perfection. A siddha is an individual who, through the practice of sadhana, attains the realization of siddhis, psychic and spiritual abilities and powers. Mahasiddhas were practitioners of yoga and tantra, whose historical influence reached mythic proportions throughout the Indian subcontinent and the Himalayas, as codified in their songs of realization, or namtars, many of which have been preserved in the Tibetan Buddhist canon. The cybernetics group led the foundation for the counterculture of the 1960s throughout the promotion of the use, quote, mind-expanding possibilities of psychedelic drugs, which, along with the antinomianism of the occult, rooted ultimately in Sabbateanism, were combined with left-wing causes to produce the New Left. As outlined by Aldous Huxley, the great fiend of, you could say, the 20th century, writing in Esquire in 1949, quote, "We have had religious revolutions. We have had political, industrial, economic, and nationalistic revolutions. All of them, as our descendants will discover, were but ripples in an ocean of conservatism, trivial by comparison with the psychological revolution, towards which we are so rapidly moving. That will really be a revolution. When it is over, the human race will give no further trouble," end quote. Huxley clarified his vision in a speech at Tavistock Group at the University of California Medical School in 1969, saying the following, quote, "There will be in the next generation or so a pharmacological method of making people love their servitude and producing dictatorship without tears, so to speak, producing a kind of painless concentration camp for entire societies, so that people will in fact have their liberties taken away from them, but will rather enjoy it, because they will be distracted from any desire to rebel by propaganda or brainwashing enhanced by pharmacological methods, and this seems to be the final revolution."